In 1427, one of the most stunning upsets of the 15th century took place. A small warlord country managed to defeat one of the greatest empires on earth. This was the Battle of Xuong Giang, where Viet, as Vietnam was known at the time, broke free from 2 decades of Ming Chinese occupation. On the surface, the matchup looked impossible. The Ming dynasty commanded tens of millions of people, fielded one of the most disciplined and organized armies in the world, and could send more than 100,000 soldiers south into Vietnam. By comparison, Viet was little more than a narrow strip of land along the South China Sea, with maybe 3 or 4 million people, still drained from years of foreign rule. Yet, against all odds, the Vietnamese didn't just resist. They destroyed a massive Ming relief force. The death of the Ming general Liu Xing at Chi Lang, followed by the collapse of reinforcements under Muing, forced the Ming court to accept Vietnamese independence. What should have been an easy imperial victory turned into a humiliation, remembered as one of the greatest defeats the Ming ever suffered abroad. Hello, we are Heroic History, your daily history channel, bringing you 30 minutes of history every day. If you want to shape what comes next on this channel, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. In this video, we're going to break down how that happened, the numbers, the strategies, and the psychology that turned empty villages and silent roads into deadly traps. More importantly, we'll see why this battle mattered so much, not only for Vietnam's future, but for the way smaller nations could stand up to empires. To appreciate how steep the odds were, you need to look at how battered Viet was after 2 decades of Ming rule. Since the conquest of 1407, the Ming had treated the country not as a vassal, but as a directly administered province run by Ming officials and taxed like any other Chinese province. That meant heavy exploitation, farmland disrupted, traditional elites displaced, and local resistance brutally crushed. Sources describe villages emptied, agriculture weakened, and the population scattered. By the time the Lam Sin uprising began in 1418, the land was poor, the people exhausted, and supplies scarce. The law's men often lacked food and weapons. They couldn't rely on big fortresses or large stockpiles of grain. Their only real assets were courage, local knowledge, and the willingness of ordinary people to pitch in however they could. First, let's get a sense of scale. Around the year 1400, the estimated population of Viet was roughly 1.8 million people. Even if we allow for growth by the mid-5th century, we're talking about maybe 2 or 3 million total. Compare that with the Ming dynasty, which ruled over one of the largest populations in the world at the time. Estimates vary depending on the source, but historians usually place the Ming population somewhere between 60 million and over 100 million, with some even pushing the figure as high as 150 million. That means for every Vietnamese man, woman, or child, there were at least 30, maybe 50 or more people in the Ming Empire. In sheer demographic terms, Viet was a minnow swimming next to a whale. Now put that next to the Ming military machine. At its height in the early 15th century, the Ming army was considered one of the most powerful in the world. It was organized under the Wuo system, a kind of soldier-farmer arrangement that allowed the dynasty to maintain a large standing force. Discipline was tight, units were drilled, and logistics were backed by the resources of a giant empire. The Ming were also early adopters of gunpowder weapons. They had access to cannons, firearms, and powerful crossbows, in addition to traditional infantry and cavalry. And this wasn't an army that only sat at home. The Ming had spent decades suppressing rebellions, fighting Mongol incursions, and projecting power across their frontiers. They had conquered Viet once already in 1407, and they had every reason to believe they could do it again. So why did they send such a massive force in 1427? Because they had to. They had already poured men and treasure into Vietnam since the original conquest in 1407. The Lam Sin uprising led by Loy had dragged on for nearly a decade, tying down Ming garrisons and draining resources. By 1427, the Lam-Sin forces had gained the upper hand. Vietnamese rebels had been besieging Ming-held citadels, including the strong point of Dong Quan, modern-day Hanoi, and Xuong Giang, located in what is now Bacong province. This point Giang was a critical link in the Ming supply chain and one of their last secure bases in the region. If it fell, the Ming garrisons would be isolated and the empire's grip on Viet would unravel. Losing Viet would also carry a heavy political price. For the Ming court, it was about prestige, control of a strategic frontier, and influence in Southeast Asia. Viet was more than just rice fields and villages. It was the southern gateway of China. Control of this territory gave the Ming a buffer zone against other powers in Southeast Asia. It also secured access to the South China Sea, trade routes and resources like timber, metals, and manpower. If the Ming lost Vietnam, they risked opening the door for other regional players, like the emerging kingdoms of Siam or Kampa, to challenge their southern frontier. Why such overkill? Because the Ming military was used to overwhelming its enemies. This was the same army that had repelled Mongol raids, subdued massive internal rebellions, and maintained order in a vast empire. Their doctrine was simple. If there's a fire, crush it with sheer weight. A smaller expedition might fail and embarrass the dynasty. They could not allow their empire to be seen as weak, especially on their southern border. The Ming court in 1427 had to show strength. Emperor Xuande was still early in his reign, and backing down from Vietnam would look like weakness. The Lam Sun uprising had already shown surprising resilience, using guerrilla warfare, exploiting the terrain, and rallying local support. A massive army could remind everyone, rebels, border peoples, and neighboring kingdoms, that resistance against the Ming was hopeless. That's why they pulled together two massive armies and marched them south to break the siege. The court dispatched not one, but two relief armies, one under Liu Sheng and another under Mun. Together, they fielded somewhere between 110,000 and 150,000 soldiers, depending on which record you trust. Even if we take the lower number, that was an enormous army by regional standards. That's an enormous deployment for the 15th century, especially across such difficult terrain. To put it in perspective, the Ming had recently fielded similar numbers in campaigns against the Mongols in the north. Sending this many troops south into Vietnam meant the court saw the uprising as a threat on the same scale as their wars against the steppe nomads. Most European battles of the same era, like Agincourt in 1415, were fought with armies 10 times smaller. By contrast, the Lam-Sin insurgents under Elwha probably commanded tens of thousands at most, and often fewer. Their numbers fluctuated constantly because they were not a professional standing army, but a movement that drew recruits from villages, farmers, and local militias. In other words, the Ming sent an army more than 5 times that size into the mountains and jungles of Vietnam. The Viet were outnumbered at least 5 to 1, maybe more. From the Vietnamese perspective, no doubt this was a nightmare. Imagine standing on the brink of victory, but knowing 2 juggernaut armies were bearing down on you. Loy's forces had fewer men, fewer weapons, and far less food. Villages had been emptied, fields neglected, and traditional elites displaced. They couldn't possibly match the Ming in a straight-up battle on an open plain and expect to win. Their only chance was to outthink the invaders, to use the terrain, deception, and the psychology of war to turn weakness into strength. That's where strategies like the empty fort tactic came into play. Empty fort strategy, or Kong Shang, one of the 36 strategies, a classic collection of battlefield ruses that generals have studied for centuries. The idea is simple enough on the surface. When you're weak and exposed, act calm and confident and make the enemy suspect a trap. If you pull it off, they hesitate, back off, and you buy yourself time or even escape outright. The textbook story comes from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. According to the novel, the brilliant strategist Zhu Liang once found himself cornered with no troops to defend the city. Instead of panicking, he did something bold. He ordered the city gates flung wide open, sat himself on the walls, playing a zither, burned incense, and looked completely relaxed. When the enemy commander, Sima Yi, saw this, he smelled danger. He assumed Xuong had elite soldiers hidden somewhere, ready to spring an ambush. Rather than risk it, Sima Yi pulled back and Zhu Long lived to fight another day. Historians argue about whether this really happened in the dramatic way the novel tells it. Some early records are less colorful, and there's a good chance later storytellers embellished the details. So why does this matter to Vietnam's history? Because in 1427, during the Lam Son uprising against the Ming dynasty, the Vietnamese took this old Chinese trick and turned it on its head. Instead of playing the lute on a wall, they created what you might call an empty landscape strategy. It wasn't about opening city gates. It was about making entire villages, roads, and valleys in the path of the Ming armies look abandoned. So abandoned that the Ming invaders thought the defenders were broken, beaten, and on the run. What's striking here is the psychological inversion. The classic empty fort strategy works by scaring the enemy into thinking you're stronger than you are. The Vietnamese version worked by making the enemy think you were weaker than you were. So weak it was safe to march straight in. Ling already believed Viet was a small, weak state. He assumed that once his troops showed up, the locals would scatter and the rebels would collapse. This arrogance wasn't entirely baseless. For 20 years, the Ming had occupied Viet, and many of their campaigns in other regions had ended in quick, decisive victories. Liu Shang stepped into the campaign thinking he would repeat that pattern. This is where the Vietnamese plan shines. They didn't just hide, they put on a show. Villages along the Ming route looked deserted. Fires were left burning with meals half-eaten. Grain was scattered on the ground. Bridges stood unguarded. To any scout or officer, these were the classic signs of a population fleeing in terror. It wasn't sloppy planning by the locals. It was deliberate staging. The Vietnamese understood how invading armies read the land. Soldiers and commanders rely on visual cues. If a village is empty, it means the enemy has abandoned the area. If food is spilled, it means people fled in a hurry. When scouts brought back reports of deserted villages and spilled grain, Liu Sheng had two options: advance quickly to crush a retreating enemy, or hold back cautiously in case of a trap. From his perspective, caution looked like cowardice. His emperor had sent him with a massive force to rescue besieged garrisons. Delay could mean those strongholds fell. His personal reputation was on the line. The evidence of Vietnamese panic seemed to confirm his expectations. So he chose to advance. The trap worked because it wasn't just military. It was psychological. It manipulated pride, pressure, and ambition. Now, add the terrain into the picture. Chilang Pass wasn't some open plain where you could see for miles. It was narrow, rugged, flanked by mountains and bamboo forests. Valleys cut through the region like natural corridors. Visibility was poor. Scouts couldn't get a wide view of what lay ahead. In such landscapes, silence and emptiness can mean two things. Either the enemy is gone or an ambush is waiting. The Vietnamese made sure the empty signs leaned toward the first interpretation. They wanted the Ming to believe that the rebels had broken. And in a place where you couldn't see beyond the next bend, those staged clues felt convincing. The weather made it worse. The campaign began in September. During the transition to the monsoon season, heavy rains could turn paths into mud. Supply wagons slowed down. Soldiers slogged through soaked fields. For an army already spread out over such a long supply line, every storm was a threat. And remember, Ling's army wasn't a nimble strike force. We're talking about 150,000 men, plus horses, carts, and supplies. 150,000 people would fill 2 modern football stadiums, shoulder to shoulder, and every one of them was armed, uniformed, and moving as part of a single war machine. Just feeding that many soldiers would take hundreds of tons of rice every day, not counting horses and pack animals. The line of march alone could stretch for miles. If you were standing on a hill watching them advance, the column would take hours, maybe the better part of a day to pass by. What looked at first like empty resistance was really the Vietnamese choosing the battleground with absolute precision. The longer they marched into this staged emptiness, the thinner and weaker their supply chain became. When an army of that size starts to feel pressure, the natural instinct is to push harder, to finish the campaign quickly before morale breaks. That urgency made Liu Sheng more likely to believe the illusion of a fleeing enemy. So, how exactly did the ambush unfold? Elwes's men were hidden everywhere in the forests, behind bamboo thickets, high on the ridges, and even beneath the ground. They had dug pits lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, then disguised them with branches and mud. Others placed slippery logs and obstacles in the narrow paths. When Liu Sheng's men finally pushed into the narrowest point of the valley, the trap snapped shut. Vietnamese troops poured down from the slopes, arrows and crossbow bolts raining into the packed ranks. At the same time, cavalry hidden behind ridges charged forward, cutting off retreat, cutting the Ming soldiers, cutting off retreat. The Ming soldiers, already tired from the long march and lulled into false security, were hit at the exact moment when their formation was weakest. Liu Sheng himself was caught in the chaos. Accounts describe how he became separated from his main body and his guards could not protect him in the crush. In the confusion, he was pulled into an ambush, struck down and beheaded. His death was not just a tactical blow. It was a psychological earthquake. For an army that large, leadership mattered enormously. Once word spread that their commanding general had been killed, panic rippled through the ranks. Imagine being one of those soldiers hundreds of miles from home, deep in hostile jungle terrain, hearing that your general's head had been taken. That was enough to break morale. The Ming formations collapsed, and thousands were slaughtered in the valley. But the story doesn't end there. Remember, the Ming had a second force led by General Mune, marching in support. In theory, he was supposed to link up with Liu Sheng and crush the Vietnamese between 2 armies. Instead, when news reached him that Liu Sheng had been killed, everything changed. His men's morale faltered before they even saw the enemy. The Vietnamese made things worse by intercepting messengers and sending false letters. Some of these forged documents claimed that Liu Sheng was still alive but retreating, while others spread panic by confirming his death. Some of these forged documents claimed that Liu Sheng was still alive but retreating, while others spread panic by confirming his death. This psychological war sowed doubt and confusion. Then there was the problem of supplies. Ma Shang's force had marched deep into Vietnamese territory, and their supply lines were stretched thin over hundreds of miles. The Vietnamese guerrillas constantly harassed the baggage trains, cutting off food and fodder. Some soldiers began to go hungry and without grain. Horses weakened. In a pre-adorned army, logistics mattered as much as weapons. And here, the Vietnamese were masters. Slowly but surely, hunger and fear wore the Ming down. Finally, surrounded and isolated Ma Shang's troops began surrendering in groups. By late 1427, facing no good options, they withdrew and ultimately surrendered without even offering a decisive battle. In a matter of weeks, the Ming Hundred of Thousands relief expedition had been destroyed or forced into retreat. The consequences were immediate. The Ming court could not sustain its occupation without garrisons and supply lines. Their armies had been annihilated, their prestige shattered. In early 1428, Loi declared himself emperor, taking the throne as Lefy II and founding the later Lilei dynasty. The Ming had no choice but to accept the new reality. They withdrew their troops and within a few years formally recognized Dai Viet as an independent kingdom. For the Vietnamese, this was not just a military victory, but a rebirth of sovereignty after 2 decades of foreign rule. When we step back and look at the whole campaign, it plays out almost like a textbook on how a smaller force can outwit a massive empire. The Ming marched in with the size of a modern city, confident they could crush what they saw as nothing more than a local rebellion. But the Vietnamese didn't try to match them soldier for soldier. Instead, they turned everything into weapons. The Vietnamese had vanished on purpose, hiding entire armies in forests, bamboo groves, and mountain passes. Ordinary villagers took part as well, moving livestock into hidden valleys, burning food stores so they couldn't be seized, and even guiding Ming scouts down misleading paths. This wasn't a small group of soldiers pulling off a trick. It was a society-wide deception, a kind of empty landscape strategy where every farmer, woman, and child played a role. Think of it like a stage play. The Vietnamese were the directors. The land was their stage, and the Ming soldiers became unwilling actors. The abandoned huts and deserted fields were the props. Everything was arranged so the Ming would see exactly what they expected: a desperate enemy in retreat. And once the invaders accepted that story, they walked straight into kill zones. This is why numbers alone don't tell the story. On paper, the Ming had everything: overwhelming manpower, 2 decades of occupation behind them, the wealth of an empire, and imperial prestige. But war isn't just math. It's about morale, decisions, and perception. The Vietnamese victory wasn't built on brute strength. It was built on understanding how to control the story, how to make the enemy see exactly what they wanted them to see. The bigger insight here is that intelligence, patience, and community effort can defeat brute force. Empty houses and broken tools weren't just clever tricks by generals. They were the work of ordinary people, shaping the battlefield in their own way. It was one of the earliest and clearest examples of a total people's war in history. Everyone from soldiers to farmers to children played a role in crafting the illusion that drew the Ming into disaster. Brains and patience turned the tide. That's why the defeat of the Ming at Chiang and Xuong Giang stands out as more than just a battle. It's a powerful reminder of small state resilience against a global superpower. A story of how an empire's numbers were undone by the cunning of a determined people. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share it with a friend who loves history as much as you do. Drop a comment below and let me know what part of this campaign surprised you the most. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories about the battles, the strategies, and the people that shaped our world. Thanks for sticking around until the end. That's all for today's campaign, and I'll see you tomorrow with another chapter from history.